Hello everyone, it's me once again. The school year has finally come to a close, so it's time for another summer of videos. My most recent reviews were about the Super Mario Galaxy games, both of which were nearly an hour long. After all of that, I'm a little bit tired out from Mario, so in the interest of once again avoiding fatigue, I've decided that I want to focus on something else this summer. I'm talking about the PS2 era Ratchet & Clank games, a series I've wanted to make videos about for roughly a year now. That's right, the first game, Going Commando, Up Your Arsenal, Deadlock, Size Matters, and Secret Agent Clank will all be getting videos throughout the upcoming months. Perfect timing too, since this year is actually the 20th anniversary of this legendary series. Of course, I'm kicking it off with the only reasonable place to begin, Ratchet & Clank, originally released for the PlayStation 2 in 2002. Honestly, at this point, does this system even need an introduction? I've already mentioned it at least once in most of these reviews by now, but to this day, it remains the best-selling console in the history of the games industry. It was coming off the success of the first PlayStation, which itself was already the most successful game system ever up to that point. So with its follow-up being clearly labeled as such, what else did you expect to happen? Not to mention, it had exciting new graphics on par with, if not exceeding the Dreamcast, backwards compatibility with the PS1, DVD playback in an era when DVD players cost an arm and a leg, and most importantly, a huge library of its own iconic games. While I personally swear by the GameCube as my favorite system, I can't deny that the PS2 is right up there alongside it, and I can easily see why someone would call it the best console in history. Oddly enough though, for as much as I talk about them, I haven't yet reviewed a game on a PlayStation console. Okay, maybe Sonic Heroes technically counts, since that came out on PS2 alongside the other systems, but I don't even own that version, so I don't think it does. It's mostly because I mainly focus on Nintendo games, either first or third party, but this is what this marathon is designed to remedy. It's almost too fitting that the first games on one of those platforms I've chosen to review on my channel happen to make up my favorite PlayStation series, which is of course Ratchet & Clank. I really like these games, and ever since my first playthroughs, I've ended up revisiting them at least once yearly, and I didn't even grow up with them. Ratchet & Clank itself as a series may not need any introduction if you're even somewhat familiar with the PlayStation, since it's one of the most iconic series, but I just can't resist talking about this stuff. The franchise is the brainchild of Burbank-based studio Insomniac Games, founded by Ted Price. They got their start in 1996 with Disruptor, a Doom clone released on the original PlayStation, but this title would sell poorly enough to nearly put them out of business. Thankfully, 2 years later, they would have their first commercial hit, Spyro the Dragon, again on the PS1, which managed to sell millions and establish Insomniac as one of the PlayStation's premier developers. They would then go on to create 2 more games in the Spyro series, pushing both that series and the PS1 hardware to its limits by the end. Spyro was another franchise of games I'd like to cover someday, but not right now. Anyways, by the time Spyro Year of the Dragon had come out in 2000, the PS2 was already out in Japan and was on its way in other regions. Feeling that they had done all they could do with Spyro, and given the fact that the IP was technically owned by Universal, the company that both Insomniac and Naughty Dog had partnered with in the 90s, Insomniac knew it was time to create an all-new IP for the then latest game system. Thus began a long brainstorming phase in which the company tried to come up with their next IP. They went through a couple ideas, including a sort of fusion between Zelda and Tomb Raider called Girl with a Stick, but eventually settled on what Chief Creative Officer Brian Hastings described as an alien traveling from planet to planet collecting gadgets and weapons. Unsurprisingly, this basic idea was the foundation for what would eventually become Ratchet & Clank. Insomniac knew they wanted the main character to be an animal of some sort. At first they went with a lizard, but tried several others such as a dog or a rat. Eventually they settled on the feline-like Lombax named Ratchet that we know today. Ratchet was to have 3 robots attached to him that would extend his moveset, but this was reduced to just 1 to make the game less complicated. The robot was named Clank, and the 2 were designed as a duo in the vein of Banjo-Kazooie or Jak and Daxter. The 2 would travel through their home galaxy, all the while gathering weapons, gadgets, and upgrades for Clank that increased the duo's mobility. Ratchet & Clank released in November 2002 to positive reception, and its financial success would spawn numerous sequels, even up to this very day, with Rift Apart on PS5. I'd love to play that game, if only I had a PS5, but regardless. As I said, I didn't grow up with the Ratchet & Clank series. I did play several PS2 games over the years, but not many of the heavy hitters. Snoopy vs. the Red Baron was the main reason I even used my PS3 for anything other than movies or YouTube, and I distinctly remember the days when me and my brother would play King Kong, Stuntman, Monster House, or even GTA Vice City. Other than that, though, I had minimal experience with PS2 games, and even PlayStation in general. It wasn't until the tail end of 2018 when I would get my own PS2 alongside a huge lot of games, which included the first 3 Ratchet titles. I would mostly use it for its backwards compatibility because I only had a PS1 memory card, but I would eventually get a PS2 memory card in late 2019, and would gradually play the series throughout the early parts of the next year. In fact, I choose to believe that I would have gone completely insane in that year's lockdown if I didn't have this series. Naturally, I started with the first game. While I did have some issues on my initial playthrough, playthrough and I got pretty frustrated and even somewhat pissed off at points. I generally liked the game and thought it was fun in spite of its issues. It inspired me to play the rest of the games on the PS2 and even pick up Deadlocked, and after finishing them, this was cemented as one of my new favorite game series. When I eventually came back for second playthroughs last year, I actually had a similar experience to Super Mario Galaxy and gained an even deeper appreciation for this first game. Despite the issues and jank that come from being the first game in the franchise, Ratchet 1 is a great entry in the series to this day, and I even think it's somewhat underappreciated. So with that all laid out, let's get into it. As I was saying, Insomniac made Ratchet & Clank to be an adventure across the cosmos. I don't know what it is about me reviewing games where you travel across space recently, that's just how things work out, I guess. The game opens up with the titular Lombax Ratchet living an ordinary day in the life on his home planet, Veldin. He's working on a ship that he wants to use to finally leave the planet and explore the Solana galaxy where the game takes place, but unfortunately doesn't have the robotic ignition system that he needs to start it up. Meanwhile, we see that a robot factory on a nearby planet, Core-2, is producing a series of warbots for a currently unknown purpose. The computer spits out one that's much smaller, seemingly as a mistake. This robot, named XJ0461, I'm just gonna call him Clank because, spoiler alert, that's his name, sees something concerning on a nearby infobot. Clank is seen by one of the guard bots who tries to catch him, but he manages to flee and escape the planet with a ship. Over Veldin, he's shot down and crashes nearby Ratchet's garage. After making his way over to the crash site, Ratchet finds Clank and brings him back over there with him. Clank then wakes up and gives Ratchet the rundown on what's happening. The factory he was created in is owned by Chairman Drek, the main villain of the game and the leader of the race known as the Blarg. Clank shows Ratchet the infobot he stole from the factory. I think it's best to let the game do the talking here.
We are constructing a pristine new world using the choicest planetary components available. So, what does this mean to you might ask? Using highly sophisticated technology, which you couldn't possibly understand, we will be extracting a large portion of your planet and adding it to our new one. Unfortunately, this change in mass will cause your planet to spin out of control and drift into the sun, where it will explode into a flaming ball of gas. But, of course, sacrifices must be made. Thank you for your cooperation.
Cut!
And if you don't like it, you can take your whiny, sniveling, snot-nosed populations, form a line behind me, and kiss my... We're still on? Well, turn it off, you idiot!
Yeah, as you can see, Ratchet & Clank is quite different from most of its contemporaries in the genre. Especially in the preceding generation, most platformer plots were pretty bare-bones, straightforward, and often had fairly basic writing and presentation. Ratchet & Clank, on the other hand, has a distinct edge and personality to it that really hadn't been seen up to that point. It has a unique focus on sardonic humor with a heavy emphasis on satire of consumerism and the like. As opposed to earlier games, practically every NPC in Ratchet & Clank is self-interested and greedy, demands payments to help you. Well, technically Moneybags from Spyro was also that. You know what I'm getting at here. A lot of the cutscenes are also straight up parodies of advertisements. I get that this is probably the 100th Ratchet & Clank review where you've heard that exact talking point, but it's impossible to talk about the humor in these games without mentioning it. In these first 4 games, the humor is almost entirely based on this satire. It almost feels like The Simpsons, but in space, and if every character was an alien of some sort. For me, the sense of humor in these games is brilliant, and is one of the things that makes them so great. This particular aspect will get even more pronounced in the sequels, as you'll see in the upcoming videos, but even going back to this first game, I found that the jokes and writing were just as funny and entertaining. It's always great when cutscenes feel like a genuine reward in and of themselves for making progress, and this is one of those games where that's the case. The voice acting is phenomenal, and the jokes themselves are written with the perfect balance of wit and charm to make them plainly hilarious. If you know me, you're aware that comedy is one of my favorite genres. There's almost nothing better than when something can make me genuinely laugh through incredible writing, something Ratchet & Clank is easily able to do.
If Al can't fix it, it's not broke. Right, Al? You said it, pal!
But sir, I'm sure the Captain Quark will understand once we...
Now, save it. I know how it works. You convince me to let you in, you snap a picture of the captain in his underpants, then you sell a picture to the info tabloid for $1 million bolts!
You've got it all wrong!
I'll see you later.
Bye, sweetie.
I think she likes me.
The Hollow Guys. Available only at Gadgetron headquarters for a limited time. Not to be used for illegal purposes. We're only in sanctioned areas. You will not actually become a robot.
You sure showed him.
Back to the main story, Clank makes it clear that Drek's plan to harvest chunks of planets to create his own after the Blarg's previous homeworld Orxon was polluted is detrimental to the galaxy. He says that they need to enlist the help of Captain Quark, a famous hero who's apparently saved the galaxy in the past. The two then make a deal. Clank will start Ratchet's ship if he helps to defeat Drek and save the galaxy. He agrees, and as the two leave Velden, Drek spots them and sends his troops after them. And with that, you have the setup for Ratchet and Clank. If you ask me, the plot in this game is quite well done and is one of the titles that set a new standard for video game storytelling. Before this point, story was more so a means to an end and served the basic purpose of providing surface level context for what you do in the game. At least in the realm of the platforming genre, Ratchet and Clank was one of the first to attempt and succeed at making story and gameplay more hand in hand, with the two being intertwined and complementing one another. The Sonic Adventure games attempted something similar, and to some degree they were successful, but both games suffered from limited presentation that got in the way of this to varying degrees. This game, by contrast, doesn't suffer from that. As I said, Ratchet and Clank has great animation and general presentation, and the humor is very well written. That said, it also knows when to be serious and tone down the jokes a bit, as opposed to something like Sonic Colors, which takes a series that was already established as having more serious stories and obliterates any tension whatsoever for the sake of forcing jokes. Ratchet and Clank is a game that knows the opportune moments to keep the humor more restricted and double down on more serious storytelling. Especially later on when the true stakes of Drek's plan become apparent, the game isn't shy about dialing back the comedic elements to truly sell it. It also has several plot twists throughout which keep the story fresh and interesting, which would remain a staple for the series going forward. While it isn't some cinematic masterpiece or anything, the plot of Ratchet and Clank is well done overall. I wouldn't call it perfect, and I'll discuss that more in detail later, but looking at the big picture, the story is actually pretty good. Speaking of animations and presentation, Ratchet & Clank's aesthetics are one of its strongest suits as well. Even if the game didn't quite come out at the very start of the 6th generation, its aesthetics are still chock full of next generation appeal. I love the adventurous scale to all the locales here, which sells the fact we're going on a gigantic adventure through the galaxy and makes these places actually feel inhabited. From the bustling skyways of Kurwan to the vast forests and cliffs of Eudora and more, every stage is visually engaging and stands out in its own way. My favorite level in this regard is probably the Gemlik moon base, which perfectly sells the feeling of being isolated in the outer reaches of space. In general, I also love the world building they're able to create with these environments. Each planet tells its own story. Kurwan seems like a genuine place people live, Poketaru feels like a real resort, Gaspar convincingly serves as a refueling station for the Blarg, and more. I really like how the locations on each planet are given their own purpose or function like this, and it gives the galaxy a real sense of cohesion despite the wildly varied level themes. This is one of the reasons the 6th generation is my favorite ever. The games themselves may be generally more focused on polishing and cleaning up aspects that were introduced in the generation prior, but they were still able to pull off very advanced visuals and art direction for when they came out, and Ratchet is no exception. There's only two downsides to the graphics of this game. For one, the textures have some really weird level of detail effect, where they almost seem to pop in or change shape when you get close enough. This can be rather distracting, but I've seen worse in other games. Second, like 88% of the PS2's library, the game only runs in a 480i resolution. If you don't know what that means, I won't get too technical. The I in 480i stands for interlaced, which is when half of the scan lines in an image are drawn in every other frame, as opposed to progressive scan or 480p, where every scan line is drawn on every frame. 480i is a standard design for old CRT TVs, and results in a jittery, flickery image when displayed on a digital screen. I use the OSSC to upscale all my gameplay footage now, and with its relatively weak deinterlace method, you can clearly see how the footage jitters and jumps around. 480p is of course much preferred for this reason, and I'm honestly surprised with how little the PS2's library supports it, when the supposedly weaker Dreamcast from several years prior had a much higher progressive scan success rate. I would play the game on PS3, where it has widescreen and 720p, but the collection is absurdly expensive for what it is, and even suffers from issues that simply weren't there in 2002. That said, 480i can't ruin a game inherently, and it certainly doesn't in the case of Ratchet and Clank. While it doesn't make the game come off as more dated than it would otherwise, it doesn't get in the way of the otherwise solid visual presentation. The thing that has no issues whatsoever, on the other hand, is the absolutely all-star soundtrack by David Bergeau, one of my all-time favorite video game composers. I don't know if this opinion is controversial or not, but I think it's safe to say that this is my favorite soundtrack in the series. That's not to say the sequels have poor soundtracks or anything, it's just that the unique style this first game had has never really been replicated in the series since. I also find the compositions to be generally more catchy and fitting for the space theming. The game makes heavy use of synthesizers and sample loops, which gives it a strong futuristic tone. Cool thing also, my disc for this game is really badly scratched up, so on my original model PS2, the background music tends to restart too early on occasion. Recording this through the Slim for this review though, it didn't do that for whatever reason, so I was able to enjoy the music even more while playing. It's difficult to describe the genre of the music, but I don't care. It's catchy, atmospheric, and enhances the game tremendously. Have a listen to some of my favorites. I don't think I need to explain myself any further, since the music really speaks for itself. It's phenomenal stuff, and easily one of my favorite soundtracks from this era, if not in general. As you may be able to infer, Ratchet & Clank is a game focused on two things: platforming and shooting. In a way, it almost feels like how a 3D Mega Man X game could well, a good 3D Mega Man X game, because of the focus on this combo as well as some similar moves. You collect weapons either by purchasing them from Gadgetron, the supplier, or finding them in a stage. Gadgets are also either found within the stages or purchased for a sum of bolts from NPCs, and are used throughout in numerous puzzles and mechanical challenges. Much of Ratchet & Clank's gameplay revolves around shooting. Hell, it's what most of the commercials were based around. This would be bad news if the roster of weapons provided wasn't up to snuff. Thankfully, this isn't the case, for the most part. A majority of the weapons are quite good, and I rather like how they remain useful throughout the entire game. Certain situations call for certain weapons. For example, whenever small enemies are involved, you should use the Pyrocytor or Suck Cannon. If they throw tanks, gunships, or big flying enemies at you, you bust out the Devastator or Visibomb. The standard blaster and the Glove of Doom are also quite useful in a variety of situations. It's up to the player to decide what works best for any given combat scenario, which is how it should be. Also, can I just say how great these weapons feel to use? Each gun is very impactful due to a combination of the sound design and visuals. It further adds to the satisfaction of using them. I mean, even just equipping one plays an over-the-top sound effect that already makes it seem really powerful. Then you start to use them, and they cause huge explosions and blow up the enemies in a supremely gratifying fashion. As I've argued in the past, impactful sound design goes a long way in making a character feel good to play as, and Ratchet & Clank is no exception. That said, I wouldn't call the weapon roster perfect. While most of the weapons are quite useful, there are a few that aren't the greatest. For example, the Morpho Ray is a fun novelty, but far from my first choice because of its short range. Additionally, something like the Taunter is sold for a good 2,000 bolts before you can get the discount later on, which is expensive for something that doesn't do much. The Bomb Glove is quite useful in the early stages, but its short range and slow speed means it gets outclassed later on. Overall, not every weapon is a winner, but that's fine when most others are. Combat itself is also incentivized very well through a positive feedback loop. As mentioned, you have to buy your weapons with bolts, and throughout the game, you'll often encounter NPCs that demand a few thousand bolts for their services. Killing enemies and destroying crates scattered throughout levels rewards you with bolts, which is satisfying in itself because of, again, great sound design. While you are allowed to skip enemies, doing so would mean you're missing out on money, so it's always advantageous to take out every enemy on screen. This is a simple but ingenious way to convince the player to engage with the game's mechanics. Even if I die and get sent back somewhat far with all the enemies respawned, I don't mind that much because that's just another chance to make more bolts. If there is one thing I dislike about the bolts though, it's that weapons or upgrades cost too much. While you'll seemingly be collecting hundreds of them, each one is individually counted, so after a single stage you'll probably have made anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 bolts. That sounds like a lot, but in truth it really isn't. The aforementioned NPC paywalls themselves typically cost up to 4,000 alone, while weapons can set you back up to 40,000. I like the interactions with these guys, namely the plumber, and the paywalls themselves fit in with the social commentary, but it's just a bit of a pain to save up for a weapon, only to be set back a few thousand bolts because of an NPC. Also, if you get the Rhino, the game's secret super weapon.
What's a rhino anyway?
Rip ya a new one.
What did you just say to me?
R-Y-N-O. Rip ya a new one.
Why, that's the most powerful missile launcher in the galaxy. I know it's worth a lot of bolts. He must have stolen it from the Blarg.
Stolen? Look, trash can. Did I say anything about it being hot? You better watch your mouth or I'll...
Wait, don't tell me. Rip you a new one.
It costs you 150,000 bolts. You do get an upgrade later on that lowers most of these prices, like I said, but even with that, the weapons remain a pretty big investment. Not to mention, you'll often have to restock on ammo as well. It wasn't as much of an issue for me because I was aware of these things, but the first time player wouldn't be. I wouldn't mind this as much if the bolts were more plentiful, or if there was an easy way to earn them, but alas, neither is the case here. Well, technically Railguard does have that one trick with the Taunter, but I didn't even spend my bolts on that weapon on this playthrough because it's otherwise pretty useless, so rip. As for the gadgets, they provide great movement options or otherwise deepen and diversify the level design quite a bit. For example, the Hydro Displacer is used to fill pools of water so you can progress, the Swing Shot allows you to clear large gaps, and all of Clank's upgrades increase your mobility. The two on-land upgrades that give you a long jump, high jump, and a way to slow your descent, while the Hydro Pack lets you hold a button down to swim much faster, kinda like Spyro. I also quite like the two pairs of boots you get. The magnet boots are slightly clunky because they don't allow you to jump and restrict you to your wrench, but are used in some pretty cool cool set pieces that, oddly enough, kind of remind me of Super Mario Galaxy. I guess those games are just still on my mind because I played them so recently. The grind boots are used in rail grinding sections, something an early 2000s game would be incomplete without. Sure, the grinding is somewhat automated, but later on in the game they get a bit more creative with the set pieces. As you progress through the game and get more of these gadgets and upgrades, you really start to feel the growth in Ratchet's moveset. It's quite satisfying. The game in general seems to take on a structure similar to a Metroidvania. Occasionally you'll come across a section on a planet you can't traverse, and the only way to do so is to come back with a gadget or upgrade obtained on a later planet. I must admit, while I don't care much for backtracking in general, I actually don't mind it that much here. Ratchet & Clank approaches it much like Spyro 3, where you're given a whole new section of the stage to play when you return. Usually you can access these sections from the beginning of the stage, but even in cases where you can't, you're given a convenient taxi or teleporter which takes you back to where you need to be. Ratchet & Clank is a game that doesn't waste your time, and I appreciate that quite a bit. However, like the weapon roster, I wouldn't call the selection of gadgets perfect either. For as cool as the swing shot is, it can occasionally be finicky. 99% of the time it works flawlessly, but every now and then it may seemingly just fail to register. The way to prevent this is to press the circle button at the top of your jump bar, and not after getting as close as possible to the swing, which isn't the most intuitive thing in the world. Still though, it's easy enough to work around this once you're aware of it. The gadget that gets more on my nerves is the Trespasser. It's a method to unlock doors, something that the coming games would also make use of. If you ask me, this gadget is the worst door puzzle of the first 4 games. You have to line up lasers with the receptacles, and once all are lit up green, the door opens. Honestly, it's just kind of a pace breaker for me. The early puzzles are pretty easy, while the later ones can take much longer. Usually I break out a guide, but on this playthrough I actually managed to solve all of them on my own. That doesn't suddenly make these puzzles fun, but yeah. At least the doors stay open permanently once you open them, so you don't have to keep solving the puzzles repeatedly after each death. Where more of the flaws of Ratchet & Clank in a gameplay sense come in is the control scheme. That's not to say this game handles like shit or that it's impossible to get used to the quirks, but in general Ratchet's movement unfortunately suffers from some jank. General movement is fine, though coming to a stop causes Ratchet to skid around a bit, which makes him feel somewhat slippery. I also find that the aiming and lock-on of your weapons can be a bit inaccurate, which is a problem when most enemies take more than one hit to die. However, the real issue of Ratchet 1's core gameplay is, and you probably saw this coming, the lack of an intuitive strafe feature. You'll hear it in every review of Ratchet 1, the game completely lacks a strafe feature, but this is only half right. While it is true you can't strafe at all for the first chunk of the game, about halfway through you unlock the thruster pack. It's primarily an upgraded version of the heli pack and makes its moves much faster, and it has a situational ground pound move. On top of that, it also allows you to strafe. Sort of. You have to come to a stop and double tap R1, which then allows you to hold R2 to lock yourself wherever the camera is pointing. While this does help somewhat, it's really only useful in certain situations where there's a crowd of enemies. In other situations, and hell, even for the first half of the game, you'll be generally confined to more close quarters combat. This is where the aforementioned faults with the weapon lock-on become more of a problem, as it can be tricky to hit enemies even closer up. While a lot of the weapons are pretty useful, not many can really be used in a pinch to save yourself from a tricky situation because of this. I did mention that the Pyrocitor, Suck Cannon, and Glove of Doom help a lot with this, but it can still be a bit tricky to accurately hit enemies with these weapons. It also doesn't help that the quick select ring doesn't pause the game when you use it, which can give enemies another chance to deal damage. You can swap weapons from the pause menu, but this is a bit tedious and slow, so it isn't ideal. Ratchet & Clank 1 typically emphasizes taking out enemies from a distance. Only a few weapons are capable of doing so with the first-person aiming mode, so these are the ones you'll want to make use of the most. In general, the combat seems more defensive on the whole than the later games in the series. If you're used to those titles, it may take some adjustment to get used to this, something I'm willing to overcome to enjoy the game. I find the combat perfectly playable and even fun in spite of these flaws, but as I've been saying, it's perfect material for improvement in later games, as it has plenty of potential that's hiding behind the somewhat dated control system. Around a third of the way through the game, you finally meet up with Captain Quark in his Blackwater City trailer. You have to pay this character to get in.
Meanwhile, I'm stuck here making 6 bolts an hour, and I have to listen to a lecture from that cheapskate Quark. So you don't get in unless I get a kickback. In advance.
And once you do, Quark says he already knows about the threat to the galaxy. The way he talks about it seems somewhat fishy, however. Almost like he's hiding something.
Ratchet, I've been keeping an eye on you. I've never seen anyone with such raw talent. You are a true hero in the making.
Really? You mean I could be famous?
Oh, absolutely.
Quark tells our heroes to meet with him at his HQ, an obstacle course located on the planet Umbris. Around this point is when the difficulty truly starts to ramp up, though it's nothing that should be unmanageable. Upon reaching the end of the course, Quark really starts to act strange.
Step into the ring of heroes, and I will finally give you what you deserve.
Ratchet, this is no time for you to become cautious. We have reached our goal.
I don't know. There's something fishy going on here.
But Clank, being somewhat naive, thinks they've reached their goal, but Ratchet is understandably skeptical. Clank pulls both of them onto the ring, and then...
Why, thank you, Clank. You've been most helpful.
Yep, it was a scheme all along. This right here is the first major plot twist in the series' history. Up to this point, both the heroes and the player were led to believe that Quark was a hero who would help save the galaxy, but as it turns out, this couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, Quark is a washed-up, egotistical douchebag. He's a disgraced hero who no one respects anymore and wants to rebuild his image. So he partnered up with Drek to be the spokesperson of his new planet, and was tasked with taking out Ratchet and Clank so they don't get in the way of the construction. Quark then leaves them in the pit to die to a snaggle beast as he returns to Drek. This twist is very well done for the first in the series. It even provides poignant social commentary. Even if someone gives off a certain image in the media, they're no less human than the rest of us, and more often than not turn out to be the most dishonest and corrupt people in society. Just because you think you know someone on camera doesn't mean you do off camera, and those who appear innocent can be hiding really dark secrets. This happens to this very day, and it's one of the main reasons I personally find modern celebrity culture to be insufferable. I get that that's a bit of a complicated topic for a simple game review, but it just goes to show how in tune Ratchet and Clank was and still is with how society operates. It's stuff like this that makes the sense of humor and presentation in these games timeless. And trust me, it gets even better in the sequels. Anyways, once this happens, you enter one of the game's boss fights. I haven't mentioned them up to this point because like most other platformers, they're really nothing to write home about. There's only about 3 or 4 in the game, and most can be simply defeated by running around and shooting. Nothing too special, though a lot better than plenty of other games I've played. The Snaggle Beast is probably the best boss in the game, as it actually requires a bit of strategy. Again, it isn't difficult to figure out, as all you have to do is shoot him until his shield appears and then lead him to one of these 3 bridges, but it's at least somewhat more compelling than most of the other fights. Afterwards, the dynamic between Ratchet and Clank shifts tremendously. Whereas before this they had a slightly standoffish yet ultimately friendly relationship, Ratchet now acts hostile towards Clank because he was the one who fell for Quark's scheme, and Ratchet then becomes completely focused on getting even with Quark. The only reason Ratchet doesn't completely get rid of Clank is because he needs him to start the ship. From this point on, Ratchet argues with and throws jabs at Clank whenever the opportunity arises, as Clank is focused on taking out Drek while Ratchet wants to go for Quark. In other words, Ratchet goes through a sort of character arc. In concept, this is awesome to hear, but I honestly have somewhat mixed feelings on how it was executed. On the one hand, it makes the protagonists more believable, further making them feel almost like real people. Even the best of friends get into arguments or tend to bicker, so it's very fitting. In addition, it makes the moment the two mend their friendship later on far more satisfying, as it actually feels earned rather than forced. I've heard that Ratchet 2016, the PS4 remake of this game, I think, dumbs down this particular aspect in favor of Ratchet being a starry-eyed kid who wants to be the hero. In my opinion, what the 2002 original does is far more compelling and true to life. On the other hand though, my issue is with how the conflict is played on a bit thick relative to what happened. Clank just fell for a scheme and the two easily managed to escape the pit, but with how Ratchet treats him, you'd think he did something far more heinous.
I will start the ship if you agree to help that commando.
So, blackmail is it?
He needs our help.
Yeah? Why don't you go help him? Into another trap? Well, go on. Go fight some evil.
Perhaps the extra oxygen will help your brain to function properly.
Yeah, and maybe the salt water will rust your mouth shut.
You are friendly, aren't you?
To you, yes. To him, no.
I'll take this over no arc at all, but in my eyes, the script could have used some slight revisions. Something that doesn't need slight revisions is the level design. Well, possibly in a few places, but I couldn't come up with a better transition, so shut it. But yeah, level design is probably the most important part of a platformer, and Ratchet & Clank doesn't disappoint in this regard. I've already talked about it somewhat, but in general it makes solid use of all your gadgets in fairly creative ways, and cleverly mixes platforming with combat. The platforming itself is designed within the aesthetics of the stage too, much like the Sonic Adventure games, which is something I love. Jumping on floating blocks all the time gets really stale after a while, so I love it when games can add that extra bit of personality and make their set pieces blend so well into the environment. The stages themselves also designed very well. Good level design can save controls that are otherwise not the greatest, and this is a very prominent case of that. It's just really fun to nail these tricky jumps, all the while taking down enemies that stand in your way. Each level also does something unique to stand out from one another. I mean, how can you not have a blast with the Umbrus obstacle course, hopping between rooftops in Metropolis, sneaking up on guard bots Metal Gear Solid style with the Hollow Guys on Core 2 and Drek's fleet, infiltrating the Gemlik base, and more. It certainly helps that each stage is paced at a steady clip, and while some levels can last a while, it never felt that way because it was always fun. A similar effect to the likes of Klonoa 2 or Sonic Heroes. On the whole, Ratchet & Clank's level design is fun, satisfying, and, excuse the awful pun, out of this world. Like everything in the game though, I wouldn't call it perfect. On occasion you'll run into a difficulty spike which may cause the first time player to die a lot. It's always a result of the flaws I've been mentioning in this review, and I imagine these occasional instances ended up a bit more difficult than intended because of them. For example, the second visit to Orxon with Ratchet is flooded with these crab-like enemies, who attack very rapidly. You only have 4 health at default, and the 5 with the nanotech upgrade, so you can only afford to take so many hits. Orxon forces you to fight these deadly enemies in close quarters, which can be extremely difficult for newcomers, like I said. Ultanis also suffers from this issue, where hordes of powerful enemies are placed in tight corners. This wouldn't be as much of a problem if it wasn't for the checkpoint system. Ratchet & Clank suffers from the same flaw as Super Mario Galaxy in this sense, where the checkpoints are unmarked. When you hit one, you won't know it unless you die, which is often not worth doing. Levels like Orxon and Ultanis both have this, and if you die you'll often get sent back a fair bit. I don't mind that much now because I see it as an opportunity to earn more bolts, but it can be trying for newcomers to deal with. I would know, I used to be in that position too. On my first playthrough this particular aspect annoyed me, but with several subsequent revisits it doesn't get on my nerves quite as much. What does annoy me more, however, is some miscellaneous stuff that the game throws in on occasion. Like most of its contemporaries from the early 2000s, Ratchet & Clank occasionally takes a break from its core shooter platformer gameplay to drift into other styles or minigames. I'll say this right here, I have no problem with genre busting or alternate gameplay or whatever you want to call it in itself. I find the resistance towards alternate playstyles on concept alone to be really barbaric and unfair towards the games in question, and always say that focusing on the quality of execution is far more important. With that said, I personally find Ratchet & Clank's minigames to be pace breakers, honestly. The Clank sections are probably the best example. Sort of like Banjo-Tooie, you'll occasionally play as Clank separate from Ratchet. This is fine in concept, but honestly these sections are a bit too slow paced for my liking. Clank's control is sluggish and the melee only combat is hilariously simple. These sections are primarily focused on puzzle solving, but it mostly boils down to leading these gadget bots through simple puzzles and using them to open doors. It's honestly pretty boring. Thankfully you only play as Clank a couple times, but in a game with otherwise quick action, these parts stand out like a sore thumb. What is more fun is Giant Clank. In this form, you get to blow even more shit up. While clunky, Giant Clank can be somewhat fun, but they only let you use them like twice in the game, so there is some wasted potential. Given that this is a shooter game from the early 2000s, it of course couldn't resist throwing in a couple turret segments. For me, these are either irritating pace breakers or boring distractions that don't add anything, and Ratchet & Clank has one of each. The first one on Battaglia is stupidly easy to clear, whereas the one on Hoven is annoying, as you have to be really precise with your shots in these Blarg helicopters, something that's hard to do with how stiff the control of the turret is. In addition, the game has a few vehicle sections. These are typically pretty mixed in platformers on the whole, and the segments with them in Ratchet & Clank are no exception. At various points, the game has 3 sections where you control a ship and shoot down targets, and 2 in which you race on hoverboards. The ship sections aren't Star Fox, that's for sure, and they're honestly not that great. Once again, they're too easy and shallow in comparison to the main game. The hoverboard racing, on the other hand, is probably the worst part of the game, bar none. They almost remind me of Sonic Riders, except not nearly as fun. My problem is that the board handles poorly, which makes it too easy to fall off the track and slam into hazards, which will cost you the race. You basically have to play perfectly, and ends up being more frustrating than fun. Thankfully, there's only 2 of these in the game, so they can only offend me so much. Once you finish the game, you're also given the option to start a new game file with all the weapons you already own on the current one. You don't have your gadgets though, so you will still have to play through the game again. I would do this, but after completing the game, I don't want to play the whole thing immediately afterwards, you know? In this mode, you also get access to gold weapons, upgrades to your regular guns, which are purchased with the game's secret collectibles, gold bolts. And a shit ton of regular bolts. Nice. The gold bolts themselves are a neat side quest, but most of them are hidden in pretty out of the way locations that aren't too intuitive to track down. In my whole playthrough for this review, I only managed to find 7 of the total 40. That said, I can still appreciate and respect the effort they put in to provide extra meat for completionists. Alright, I've been talking about this game for a while. I think it's about time to wrap things up. Ratchet & Clank eventually find out that Drek plans to destroy a planet that inhabits the perfect orbit for his new one, which he wants to do with a huge bomb called the Planet Buster Maximus. On the icy planet Hoven, the duo manage to track it down and lay waste to it, and with that Drek sends out Quark to finish them off once and for all. After making their way through the treacherous Gemlik moon base, the 2 heroes finally come face to face with Quark, who challenges them to a dogfight in his spaceship. Following a somewhat tedious boss fight, Quark is sent crashing down to the planet Ultanis below, and Ratchet finally gets a taste of the true destruction Drek is causing through an infobot. He realizes that he was in the wrong this entire time, and agrees to help Clank track down Drek and bring an end to his evil. They travel through a few planets, managing to liberate them from Blargian control, and meanwhile Ratchet comes across Quark on Ultanis, completely broke and having to serve as a street vendor. This is perhaps the most fitting conclusion for Quark, who is ultimately a pathetic distraction and not worth Ratchet's time anymore. By the point they reach Quartu, Clank's planet of origin, the two find out that the planet planet Drek plans to destroy as Ratchet's own home, Veldin. Needless to say, this makes Ratchet furious, and he becomes fully on board with Clank's plan. It's really satisfying to see this arc conclude, and the change in Ratchet's attitude feels genuine and earned. Determined to stop Drek, the two then infiltrate his flagship and discover he's using a new weapon called the Deplanetizer to demolish Veldin. It's located on the Kaizil Plateau, the same place the game began. The two heroes jump right back into the ship and hightail it there, thus beginning the final stage. And honestly, I really like it. I probably wouldn't have said that after my first playthrough, but having gotten better at the game, I can enjoy it a fair amount. I just love the idea of coming back to the same place you started, except now dangerous and swamped with the strongest enemies in the game. The aesthetic of the stage supports this, with dark colors and music making use of theremin and heavy percussion to really sell how dire the situation has become as the Deplanetizer charges up. At the end, you also have this huge crowd of gunships and Blarg juggernauts. I actually took the time to take them all out one by one, not realizing that you could just use Giant Clank. Whoops. But still, it's just so funny to kill one of them, only to have a flurry of yellow energy pulses fly directly at you. Holy crap. Once they make it to the Deplanetizer, the duo is confronted by Chairman Drek in a huge mech suit. Giant Clank attempts to destroy it, but before he can, Drek manages to reduce his size, and the two now have to fight him on foot, thus starting the final boss proper. This segment is rather infamous, and for good reason. Truthfully, the problem isn't that Drek is hard, because he really isn't. Avoiding his attacks is pretty simple, and all you have to do is shoot him and occasionally stop a countdown with a switch. The issue here is that he's a bullet sponge and takes forever to kill. Especially when they force you to do platforming in between phases, it can be really easy to die, which will make you have to restart the boss from the beginning. Dying also doesn't refill your ammo, meaning you still have to spend bolts on more, which is an issue throughout the whole game, but it's especially apparent here. If you run out mid-fight, the PDA purchased from Quark on Altana should help, but beware because the ammo is more expensive when bought from here. All in all, this could have been a pretty great boss, and it is climactic, but as is, it's a bit too long and tedious for my tastes. Upon reaching the final platform, a bombshell is dropped. Drek was supposedly working to make his new planet so the Blarg have a new homeworld, but as it turns out, this isn't true. I'll just let him do the talking for me as I did earlier.
You think that's what this is about? Who do you think polluted our last world? I did. This is about one thing and one thing only. Cash! And lots of it. You see, I've been paid for every square inch of my new world. Once the inhabitants move in, I will begin polluting this world as well. Then the whole thing starts all over again. Brilliant.
A truly despicable villain, quite possibly one of the most evil in a platforming game. While the boss fight itself is pretty drawn out, its climactic appeal is certainly still very much there. There's nothing more satisfying than having to deal with Drek all game long, going through the gauntlet of his boss fight, and then landing that last hit on him to finally finish him off. Drek goes flying onto his new planet and inadvertently reverses the Deplanetizer. You know exactly what's about to happen. Ratchet and Clank walk over to the launch button and trigger it, firing a massive laser at the planet and blowing it to pieces. Drek got a taste of his own medicine. I couldn't think of a better or more fitting finale if I tried. However, chunks of the planet knock Ratchet and Clank off the platform, and they're left hanging onto the side for their lives. Clank's arm gives out and the two fall. Right before Ratchet hits the ground and dies, Clank activates his installed thrusters and catches him, allowing the both of them to land safely. Ratchet seemingly walks off on Clank, but then...
Hey, Tin Can! Where do you think you're going? We, still need to fix that arm.
After this long journey, the two have become true comrades and walk back to Ratchet's garage to take a load off, thus ending Ratchet and Clank, but only marking the beginning of the series. I quite like this ending, and it wraps up the game's plot in a nice bow. By this point, do I really have to go on? I think this game is great, even with all the issues I've laid out in this review. The somewhat slippery controls, inaccurate lock-on, occasional difficulty spikes, boring minigames, and high prices for items may irk me a bit, but they don't get in the way of what's an otherwise fantastic experience. The story is supremely well written, the character animations were groundbreaking in their day and still look good, the jokes and satire are hilarious and offer interesting social commentary, the graphics are gorgeous in spite of the dated 480i resolution and texture pop-in, the weapons are satisfying and fun to use, the levels level design has plenty of creative puzzles and a great mix of platforming and shooting. The music has a unique style that I can't get enough of. On the whole, the game is really stylish and memorable because of these things and more. I used to find this game kind of frustrating because of its more clunky aspects, but after adapting to them, I think it's fantastic and even a bit underrated these days. Yeah, the sequels are fantastic as well, and even make plenty of improvements, as you'll see in the coming videos, but saying that alone would ignore just how much they managed to nail it on their first try. The original Ratchet Clank is, as the title says, still great even 20 years after it first came out. I'd even say it holds up better than most other first entries in game series, including Mario, Sonic, Spyro, Donkey Kong Country, Jak and Daxter, Sly Cooper. You better believe it mops the fucking floor with Crash Bandicoot's atrocious first entry, and many more. It isn't what I'd call one of my absolute favorite games or anything, but it's certainly one of the best titles I've played on PlayStation 2 at least. It just has some unfortunate issues and kinks that make it prime for a sequel to expand upon. Fortunately, that's exactly what happened. In the next video, I'll be taking a look at the second game in the series and seeing how it took the great concepts introduced in this game and made them even stronger. Thank you all for watching this video, and I'll see you next time for the game's sequel, Ratchet & Clank Going Commando, also released for the PS2. Until then, have a good one, and goodbye.
Hi, I'm Steve McQuark, and this little baby can take care of any grooming needs that are just too much trouble for you to handle yourself. Allow me to demonstrate. Yeah. Oh, mommy.
Turn it off! Turn it off!